all. My name is Blake Hillebrand, co-founder of the Sustainability Snacks and 2024 SONA President. Welcome to the April edition of Sustainability Snacks. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many Indigenous countries from which we are meeting from today. I'm currently on country that is looked after by the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We recognise their continued role in caring for country and hope this series of events can eventually contribute to caring for our environment as well. So Sustainability Snacks is a series of short online sessions that aim to demystify sustainability in practice. In just 30 minutes, we will hear from a practitioner on how they're reducing their impact. It's a joint initiative between SONA and Imagine, and we hope this knowledge sharing will help accelerate necessary climate action. So today we have Andrew Barnes from ACOR joining us to share his journey full of advocacy and learnings in heritage conservation. Before we do get started, I've got some housekeeping. We'll have Q&A after the talk. Please drop any questions you have in the chat and I'll get to them at the end. And if you could please mute, that'd be great. Over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Blake. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All good. Okay. As Blake mentioned, I'm Andrew Barnes and I'm from Brisbane, and most people call me Barnesy. So I'd like to thank Blake and Eloise for allowing me to come to talk to the next generation of architects. You will be the people that are creating our future environment and creating the places where our communities will live. These brief lectures help build your skills and grow professionally, and they're a great idea. And I've taken the idea and suggested it back to Engineers Australia. So we may invite you guys off to talk to us shortly. My working career has spanned over 35 years, and over those years I've worked on many projects with architects. And I'd have to admit I'd admire the architects for their creativity in building form. I'd suggest if I was designing a building, it'd be square, 9.9 metre grids, concrete walls and a couple of windows. So from that respect, I've certainly appreciated how lucky we have for architects. And to help that admiration, my beautiful partner is also an architect, so I have a healthy respect. So today I'll be running through my career path into sustainability through conservation and adaptive reuse, and some of the most common challenge we face, which is around code compliance during adaptive reuse. I graduated from the Queensland University of Technology in November 1989 with an engineering degree. At the time, this was the start of a recession, so work was hard to come by. On the 28th of December 1989, a significant natural disaster occurred in Newcastle, and this was the Newcastle earthquake. I'll just start to share the screen. It was a magnitude of 5.6 earthquake. 13 people were killed. There were hundreds of hospitalizations.
Sorry to stop you, Andrew. I don't think it's shared yet.
Okay, how's that?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, good. So it was a 5.6 earthquake, 13 people were killed, and there was about $4 billion worth of damage done to over 40,000 homes and businesses and buildings. This has been the most damaging earthquake in Australian history. At the time, this was one of the few places I could get a job. So I threw all my worldly belongings into a car and moved down to Newcastle for 4 years. Photos that are up on the screen at the moment show a few of the pictures that were taken after the earthquake in the coming weeks from newspapers and people's experiences. And these are all a collage of buildings that I've worked on over the 4 years that I was in Newcastle. The buildings that are numbered 1 are the Newcastle earthquake. So that building there was where about 6 people passed away when the building collapsed. So that was basically total rubble, and the building was totally removed and rebuilt. The photos that are numbered 2 are Beaumont Street. So in Newcastle, Beaumont Street was one of the first suburbs to occur outside the central CBD. and it was one of the older suburbs around Newcastle. So what they found after Newcastle earthquake was that it was the older suburbs that suffered significantly more damage, and Beaumont Street in particular had quite a lot of damage. The buildings in Beaumont Street consisted of about 2-storey brickwork, as indicated in this one, and this is the Kent Hotel. So I'll talk about that one shortly. So that was what the Kent Hotel looked like after the December earthquake. This was other parts of Beaumont Street, so many of the buildings were just total rubbish, and there were quite a lot still, as indicated here, that were still serviceable. That most of them had significant damage. At the time, there was considerable pressure to knock the buildings down and rebuild. And for me and the people that we work with, it just seemed a waste to be knocking many of these buildings down when they can certainly be salvaged with a little bit of thought and upgrade them to present codes. And what we were able to do in Beaumont Street was influence about half a dozen owners to consider the rebuild and rebuild the buildings and strengthen them to improve their reliability for if another earthquake occurred. So these are some of the buildings, and I'll just show you the Kent Hotel now. So that's the street view of the Kent Hotel today. So on the left is the Kent Hotel, which looks significantly different to after the earthquake. And on the right-hand side was one of the buildings that we've been rebuilt. Yeah, the painting scheme doesn't assist, but it's a different environment now. So if we were there the day before the earthquake, the street was lined with these buildings. They had overhangs, they had verandas on them. You walk down the street at Beaumont now, and it's a mixture of this, and the experience that people have, it's just not the same. For me, trying to save these buildings was where I found my passion, which developed into a heritage profession, which is focused around restoring places and giving them another life. And for me, it was about leaving something for the future generations. And for the Kent Hotel, it'll be there in another 100 years. For me, I was lucky. I found something I really loved early in my career in the first 3 or 4 years after graduating. It's something I love to do, and I could do it 7 days a week and not get paid for it. And, that's pretty special. So if you find something you love and you hone your skills in those areas, doors normally open and you can progress your career and life and have an increased satisfaction. So for us at the time, saving these buildings and adaptive reuse was all about sustainability. We can't always take the easy option of demolition and sending the material to landfill. Our resources are finite and we need to use them more wisely. So the first takeaway is find something you love, you will go further and contribute more and have a higher level of satisfaction. We all have things that we love and find passionate about. So from that, I had another 35 years of career in doing the Kent's Hotel. There are many challenges around being sustainable and adaptive reuse, and I'll go through one of the most common problems that we face as engineers and practitioners. Buildings built prior to 1990 and more so prior to 1970 will not comply to the present codes. So some of these codes include the disability access. It was in 1992, the federal government introduced the Disability Discrimination Act, and this made owners and designers ensure that there was equal access available to all buildings. It's a law, so we've got to comply. National Code of Construction. This applies to new construction, and while it does not require existing buildings to be brought up to standard as a blanket rule, it does state that when new work is being carried out to existing buildings, the regulations do apply. Fire. Many of the buildings built in the 17 and 1800s and early 1900s do not comply with any of the latest standards in fire. In the early 1800s, they built timber walls between shops, and what they found was that if they had a fire in one, they'd lose half the street. So they learned quickly to build firewalls and double masonry between shop lots to reduce that. Energy. I own a Queenslander, and it leaks like a sieve. If you've got air conditioning in there, it works pretty damn hard. And many of the buildings built in the last 200 years do not comply to the present standards around energy. And from engineering, it wasn't until the 1970s and the 80s where there was a giant leap forward in improving the reliability of buildings, particularly for wind and earthquake. Many of the buildings built prior to this have increased probability of structural damage during an event. And most insurance companies ask the age of the building, and this is priced into the premium as the older buildings tend to be less reliable during earthquake and wind events. So one of the biggest challenges for adaptive reuse is undertaking upgrades in a sympathetic and considered way that is not intrusive and destroys the building fabric and maintains the stories that the buildings hold. That last comment, the stories, it's probably worth having just a bit of a chat about that. And this can be missed in many times. It is the stories that link the buildings, and they can be very emotive, and they help paint a picture of the times gone past. The stories tend to link emotional connections and events, celebrations, hardship, how buildings were built. Protecting these stories and the emotional connections helps maintain stories for the future generations. It's just not about the building. And it's more about what happened in the building. And probably realize I'm not a big fan of facadism, where they just leave the facade. Stories are actually behind the facade, and this is where we try and preserve the building fabric in its entirety. There are many arguments that you can put up to demolish a building. It's too hard, too expensive, the building doesn't meet our needs. So what I was going to do is show you one of the examples of one of the oldest buildings that I've worked on. So I've worked on a number of them around the country, excuse me, and this one is in Brisbane. This is the commissariat store. This is only one of two buildings left in Queensland that was built by the convicts. So it's got a pretty high level of significance. And that's it, sitting in here, in amongst the freeway and a $3 billion resort casino that is being built at the moment. Just to provide a little bit more context about the stories of how this came to be, Brisbane was first settled as a penal outpost for the less desirable reoffenders and troublemakers from the New South Wales colonies. So during 1820, the prisoners were brought from Sydney up to Brisbane, and they were set to work to create this outpost. The first two buildings that they built were the commissariat store that were permanent, and the windmill, which is still in existence up in Spring Hill. The commissariat store was where all the food and medicine was to be housed for the outpost. So it's like the Coles of yesteryear. The location they set was on the banks of the Brisbane River, so all supplies could be brought up and offloaded quickly. What they didn't realise at the time was this building was set in rock. So the rock level around the building is up around the two-storey level. The prisoner gangs were set to work, and they were gangs of 15 to 20 that would work on this building each day, and it took them a year to excavate the rock for this building. The rock was that hard. So they worked 6 days a week, daylight to dusk, and got the seventh day off. That, just imagine working on this for a year with pick hammers, lowering this level with the rock, which would have been a pretty hard life. It took them another 12 months to build the building, and all of this materials were sourced within a kilometre or so of the building. So all the stone, the timber, the limestone. And for the time, it's a pretty impressive job. It was built by unskilled prisoners in a pretty intense environment. And that's part of the story of these buildings. Move forward 200 years, and the Queensland government owned the property and were looking to re-establish it. The Royal Historical Society of Queensland became the tenant, and the Queensland government commissioned an upgrade of the building to present code. So for the Queensland government, complying with present codes was non-negotiable. So we had to bring this building up to present codes. The top level was fitted out with offices. The level below, part of it was fitted out as a museum. You can see the artifacts. Some of these came from the site and were dug up during excavations. The layout doesn't quite suit modern day amenities with regular columns. While it's suitable for engineers, it's not as suitable for the general public. The lower level was opened up. And this was where they were going to have lectures and series and make it more of a community area. So they were able to redesign and took out the columns and put in a lightweight steel structure. We also put in a lift. And this lift is independent of all the building and is run on 2 rails at the back. So we've complied with all the structural and disabled access requirements. And one of the features is that there's no lift call, there's no big obstruction. And when you're looking at the building on the ground floor, you can hardly know that there's been any intrusive environment. So it's a minimal touch to satisfy the present codes. And what we've also done is made interpretation. So there was this section here on the floor was opened up. So all the drainage underneath was carved into the rock for the stormwater and the sewer. So people can come in and see how the subfloor and the detail that has gone into putting the plumbing and the drainage into the building 200 years ago. So this is a great example of adaptive reuse and to comply with present codes. The outcome here is where the building is going to be probably preserved for many hundreds of years to come. It's lasted 200 years in this state, and it'll last another 200 or 300 years, and it'll probably outlast the $3 billion casino that is being built next door. So for me personally, this provides a lot of satisfaction that we're able to keep these jewels for future generations, and many people can now come and enjoy and understand part of their history. So adaptive reuse is being sustainable. Our resources, they are finite. In going and demolishing it and changing it, it's in sending the material to landfill, it's hardly being sustainable. So taking up 15 minutes of your time, I hope this provides some motivation to consider adaptive reuse and options when managing older buildings and prior to going to the demolition option. Hopefully I've been able to provide a few points along the way that will help influence building owners on adaptive reuse. And adaptive reuse is being sustainable. Our resources are valuable and they are finite. And the removal of these buildings is hard to justify. I've shown you one of the examples of one of the oldest buildings remaining in Queensland, built from natural materials, unskilled labour, and absolutely no thoughts of codes for construction at the time. So it's pretty easy. It just needs a little influence, a little bit of creativity, and that's where your profession comes in, and we can save some of these wonderful buildings for the future generations. I realised in my career that I can contribute more by being part of the conversation and the policy making, and to help influence more people to think about being more sustainable and adoptions of adaptive reuse. I probably give 1 to 2 days a week free to various bodies and advocacy for maintaining and preserving buildings and giving them a new lease of life. So for me, this is my little contribution to influence a few more others. So with that, I'll hand it back to Blake, and I look forward to seeing the environment that the professional people here will create. And I wish you all well in your careers and hope they're rewarding and fulfilling. So over to you, Blake. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was really good. I'll kick us off with some questions. The first one, what was the hardest part about that project you had up on the screen, do you think?
The hardest part was going through and securing the approval. So it probably took about 12 months to go through and secure all the latest code of design and get it signed off by all the relevant departments. So it is a slow process, but for the investment that they've put into that building, to demolish it and build something else would have been a lot more. And they've got something now it'll last hundreds of years, that building, and it's something to be proud of.
And in terms of your comment about a lot of heritage projects just having a facade being kept and then you kind of create something internal that's new, what do you think we can do as a profession to improve that when a lot of those projects can't actually use what they've got? So they obviously have to use that facade.
From some of the councils have advocated for maintaining street facades like Beaumont Street. So if you went down Beaumont Street prior to the earthquake, it's a different environment. It's just like walking down the street 100 years ago from a building's perspective. Some councils advocate for keeping the facade. And that, yes, that is valuable, but it's what's behind the facade, the rooms, the form, and the life that occurred. And if we can keep and maintain some more of that, there'll be a lot more passion and understanding of these buildings, and the stories can be told. The Indigenous culture, one of their biggest things that I've learned over the years is the storytelling. So they can pass stories down from one generation to another for hundreds of years, and families can pass stories down about the Kent Hotel and the commissariat store. And there's a little bit more there than just a facade. So trying to maintain it and be creative about how we interact that with other buildings, that's where the architects and their creativity comes in. And I have to admire some of the pieces of work that they've done around the place over the time.
Another question. How do you determine what is of more heritage value than something else? Because obviously you're always going to be coming up against coming up with ideas and then decisions you need to make.
Yep, that's a very good question. With places that are on the state register or local heritage register, most authorities encourage the owners to do a conservation management plan. And what that'll do is go through and have a professional practitioner go through and identify all the main fabric, all the main items, and see, okay, prioritize these are don't touch, or these ones are intrusive and you can remove. So that gives you a good starting point to be able to use as a basis, because many of these buildings have had works done over them over 100 years, and some of that work can be quite intrusive. And to take it away is actually better off than leaving it there. So having a conservation management plan undertaken on heritage sites is a great start, and it'll identify what is valuable and what can be removed.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few more questions. We've got from Karen. Hi, Andrew. How can we encourage keeping exemplar modern and postmodern heritage buildings through adaptive reuse? I am from Hobart. We lost 10 Murray Street.
Yes, and this is something that we've been talking about in recent times. if you go to the Queensland Heritage Register, most of the buildings are from the early 1900s to 1800s to 1700s. The representation is very low on in the last 50 years, and we're trying to do something about that. And recognising in Queensland the Cultural Centre, which was done by Robin Gibson, and other buildings to sort of put them on the register from an importance point of view. So we just don't have the old buildings. We have a good representation. And that's where the architects can play a very pivotal role, because you understand these buildings, and you know some of the designers like Harry Seidler and others that have been very influential, and some of their buildings should be preserved. And one of the great ways of doing it is putting it on a heritage register and changing the views of governments and departments that something built 20 years ago, well, it should be around in 200 years because of the significance of the designer, the form. And Riverfront Place up here in Queensland, it was ahead of its time in what they were trying to do when they were designing that precinct. So putting it on the Heritage Act, and the architects being more putting their hands up and being supportive and promoting some of these excellent examples of architecture around the country.
We have another question from Cassandra. Who championed the sustainable adaptive approach in Newcastle and Brisbane? Was it local council or the owners?
It was actually the owners and the consultants. So, and it was only probably in the last 15, 20 years that government bodies have sort of had a mindset shift. So prior to that was by some of the owners, people like the owners of the Kent Hotel. They took pride and it had been in the family for years, so they wanted to keep it. So those ones were easy. The other ones is, well, if it's $500,000 cheaper than knocking down and rebuilding it, well, let's readapt it and redo it. So for others, it was dollars. But it was only since the last 20 years that governments and other parties have been more proactive in trying to maintain some of our heritage.
But Liam, thank you so much, Andrew. Super insightful. It's been fun to observe the Queen's Wharf project being constructed over the years. However, like you said, it likely won't last in the same way that your project will. Do you reckon a part of the benefit of adaptive reuse that lends itself to its longevity, i.e. its material choice and fortification through modern codes?
Yeah, in terms of the commissariat store, it's built of rock, built of timber. Provided you keep timber dry, it'll be here in another 1,000 years. So the termites and water are the two contributors to decay of timber. So if you can keep both of those out, the timber will have a infinite life. With Queen's Wharf, as soon as you stick reinforcement in concrete, you've put a design life on your building. So if you're on the coast on the Gold Coast, you'll probably get 50 to 100 years out of a concrete reinforced building sitting on the ocean. If you're out in the middle of Australia, you might get hundreds of years. So, but when you stick reinforcement in concrete buildings, you've basically given it a design life, and it won't be here in 500 years like this structure. It's got no reinforcement, and provided they keep the termites and the water out of the timber, it's rock. It lasts, just like the pyramids and other European countries where they've got artifacts and structures that are thousands of years old. They're built from base principles prior to using calculations to refine concrete thicknesses, and instead of building structures out of solid concrete and solid stone, we're doing reinforced concrete walls that might be 200 thick and putting reinforcement in it. But when you put reinforcement in it, this time, there's no technology that will stop carbonation and the corrosional reinforcement over time. Until that happens, there is a finite life on concrete structures. And just depending on where you are, we'll do. So in this one, these are just natural materials, and it's rock, and it'll just last as long as rock does. And those walls are 400 or 500 thick in some locations, so it's not going to erode in any time soon.
I've got last question from Georgius. As an architect, in terms of adaptive reuse, most of the heritage buildings may need a new material and new structural system. How does an architect handle in terms of proposing and choosing these types of materials and structure, as it is sometimes challenging to get the design approved?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are, the Borough Charter helps set down those, the basic rules, and there's various thoughts along it. In the commissariat store, we use steel, which is different to what the properties were at the time. And when you're interpreting the building, you can have you can see what was the old original one and what is new. So when you come and do new structure, in some cases it's better to use a different material so you can definitely tell what was original and what was new. And trying to keep it sympathetic and not destroy the building fabric is one of the, do as little as you can and as the most that you have to do to maintain what you've got there on site.
We just got a comment from K Patton.
Don't listen to him.
Also, we've got another question. Also, how does an architect help the owner of the heritage building to consider preserving the building? Especially, some might be afraid to preserve the building because of the cost and affordability. How can an architect convince the owner to preserve the heritage value?
Yeah, the costs always come up, and in some cases, cost can be a contributing factor to owners. The cost to maintain the commissariat store is minimal. Where you've got timber buildings that are exposed to weather, the costs are more substantial. But if you own a brand new home, you've still also got to do maintenance cost. So it's just it's just a cost of owning the buildings, and many of the people that own heritage listed places take great pride in them, and they wish to keep them for future generations. So the cost, there is a cost. There are grants out there from time to time from government authorities to help with heritage listed buildings, and the cost of maintaining a heritage listed building sometimes is not much different to maintaining a new building.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It was really insightful and particularly interesting to see a different perspective of a project when most of the time we've had architects and people within architecture on. So that's been really fascinating. Before we do head off, keep an eye out for the May edition of Sassy Snacks. We've got Liz Brogden talking about how real climate action is regenerative. So yeah, have a good rest of your day. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the time.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.